Thank you for coming, everyone. Today we have Xianin Li, or Li Xianin, depending on how do you order, name and family name. With us, as many of you know, he's teaching this year with us, this term with us, but his position in Tongji University is now professor, correct me if I'm wrong, and deputy dean of the College of Architecture and Urban Planning, and dean of the Chino-Spanish College of Tongji University, and this is why we have had a good relationship, seeing him for the first time in Madrid, and then in Tongji, and then here. He has several books written, like Expedient Architecture, Young Architects and Chinese Tactics, 2005-2006, Architecture as Resistance, Wang Shu and His Architecture, Wang Shu the Pritzker, 2012 and 2004. He's also been very actively involved in creating recently some biennales, as the Shenzhen Hong Kong Biennale of 2013, the Shanghai Urban Space Art Season in 2015, and also he is a member of CICA, yeah, which is an international organization that contains the most important historians and critics. I have asked him to really try to make in such a short time and a panorama, or a vision, more than a panorama, his vision on what is happening now in the Chinese architecture, because I think this is a key moment for us. I mean, and for the Chinese architecture, the young generation has evolved and is not mimicking, let's say, other cultures, and at the same time we are beginning to understand the huge amount of production has passed from the quantitative to the qualitative now, and this is a very important moment. So please join me in welcoming Xianin Li, and let's hear him. Thank you. We have respondents as Chris Lee, that mostly all of you know because he's teaching in the school from several years ago. Eduardo Prieto, visiting scholar, and John May, that is not so long time ago teaching with us. So thank you.
Thank you for having me here, and thanks to IACI and also to GSD. Today the topic is building a new tradition. I'm going to, because IACI asked me to cover the kind of the history turn, maybe not a history turn, but the Chinese new emerging architectural practices that are trying to rebuild the connection with our past, with our tradition and history as well. So China has seen cities and buildings advancing triumphantly for the past 3 decades. So at a speed and scale that never seen in the West. So high-rise buildings are springing up swiftly in the cities, while the historic blocks built over hundreds of years ago are being dismantled. So the rapid advent of modernity is accompanied with the disenchanting and the duplication of modern Western civilization. China's construction industry thus have received severe criticism from the international academia that perhaps the loss of China's unique culture, characteristics, and its breaking from the past construction tradition will bring about nothing but water without a source and trees without roots. So Chinese contemporary artists are more sensitive to the crisis of our own identity, also the breaking of an inherent connection to history. Artists like artist Wang Feng, this is one of the most active and important contemporary Chinese artists, Wang Feng, illustrates the in-between situation of China's history and future, its imagination and also its dirty reality. So while artists like also another artist, this is Wang Feng, and another artist, Yang Yongliang, tries to melt the ever-growing urban landscape into a historic reflection of Chinese traditional ink and wash paintings. So ironically, rebuilding a lost connection of China's history and reality. So these are some projects he worked on and also shown in some exhibition at the Dresden system. I will touch upon this again. In a review made 10 years ago, I once pointed out that China's architecture were either adapting brand new architecture forms which had no cultural association with the Chinese tradition at all, or duplicating simply the images of traditional Chinese architecture, or making simple appropriation of traditional Chinese typology, such as gardens, rather than translate them into contemporary language. Today, when I look back and rely on the changes that have taken place over the past decade, I'm pleased to see that the contemporary Chinese architects are employing constantly the new product emerging in multitude to express their interpretation to the traditions in plural, yet individual manners. A cultural consciousness rooted in the collective unconsciousness is taking on in varied contemporary forms. So as a matter of fact, the contemporary Chinese architects are more concerned with the interpretation to the tradition due to influence from these aspects as follows. Firstly, the presentation of the mainstream architectural system to the so-called Chineseness, or the subject that embodies the national image that symbolizes the power, is mainly shown in buildings carrying the meaning of political declaration. I will use this example. For example, in the 2010 Shanghai World Expo, China Pavilion took the so-called Oriental crown as a metaphor, as a form of metaphor. So this awkward direct borrowing of historic image always reminds me of a Chinese artist's work shown in an exhibition entitled The Living Chinese Garden in Dresden National Museum of Germany in 2009, in which I also participate. So this installation shows some ridiculous botanic gardening technology to create weird-shaped tree branches to satisfy a kind of unhealthy appreciation of forms, also in the traditional form of China. And also it could be also taken as a metaphor of distortion of architectural forms to satisfy the weird taste for history and power. So as a contrast, the good news that the Wang Shu won Pritzker Prize and an architect from Beijing, Li Xiaodong, won Aga Han Prize, respectively played a significant role in pushing China's architectural culture to turn to another direction. Thirdly, as the urban, these are some projects. Thirdly, as the urban expansion progress is going to a limit when the economy of China is going down a little bit, so the speed will be slowed down. While expanding outwards, the cities must turn to inside themselves to tap on the potential for a new round of development, so urban regeneration. That is to take urban regeneration and rural construction as a main drive to the future architectural development, which also breeds possibility to recreate the kind of traditions. So in the city centers, two evolutions are taking place simultaneously. One is the transformation and reuse of existing urban architecture, and the other, the conscious employment of traditional spaces, materials, and processes in the newly built public buildings and residential buildings. So in Beijing and Shanghai, both the biggest cities in China, the wave of urban renewal is in full swing. A series of transformations to Hutong, a unique type of living spaces in Beijing. This is one picture of the life in Hutong, have come up. Architect Zhu Pei instead inserted the contemporary metal box into the traditional space in the transformation of a famous Chinese artist, Cai Guoqiang's courtyard, hence forming a kind of juxtaposition of tradition and modern materials. Another architect, the Young Architect Office, PAO office, also introduced the contrasting boxes into the plug-in housing project. This is a plug-in house project. These are the interiors and life happening there. Also, another alumna, a graduate for the GSD, Zhang Ke, whose office is called Standard Architecture, recreated the kind of routine spaces by inserting a serial of boxes into its micro Hutong program. And also the Archi Studio Archi Studio implanted the artificial nature of the post-industry era into the traditional texture of its Hutong tea house program. It's a new tea house built in the Hutong. So it is the case with the Hutong transformation by the TAO office. In the meanwhile, architects in Shanghai. So these are some the tea houses in the Hutong in the city of Beijing, and another projects by TAO. He's a graduate from Yale School of Architecture and started this architecture practice. No, that's a name shouldn't be mentioned here. I know, and. So in the meanwhile, architects in Shanghai, so also the birthplace of China's modern industry, have completed the transformation of a series of industry buildings. Architects from Atelier This House, the Mr. Liu Yichun, who gave a lecture at the Piper 2 days ago, revived the heritage of industry architecture, the Long Museum at the West Bund of China of Shanghai. They refined and made modular application of the remaining structural elements and created a kind of symphony of light, shadow, and structure. And another architecture office, Original Design, not only transformed the power plant into the exhibition space of the Power Station of Art, which is used as the Museum of Modern Art in Shanghai, successfully, but also turned and also an old spike factory into a brickwood modern office space for its own use. This is the interior of the Museum of Modern Art in Shanghai. And Taiwan needs the Neri and Hu, their Singapore and Taiwanese architect office, transformed the kind of workspaces by the old wharf in Huangpu River into a minimalist boutique hotel, so it's called Water House. And while architect Zheng Qun transformed the multi-level bus garage of a bus company, so it's a huge. This is the interior of this is the interior of the Water House on the Huangpu River. And this is a Tongji Architectural Design Institute by the architect Zheng Qun, who transformed the multi-level bus garage of a bus company into a modern headquarters of an architectural design institute. So obviously, it is more challenging to create contemporary buildings in the urban areas than to transform the existing ones. So also the return to the traditions due to options of more strategies thus becomes the expression of positions like Wang Shu has become a flag of contemporary Chinese architectural culture after winning the Pritzker Prize. In the southern Song Imperial Street project in Hangzhou, as he always does, traditional wood, bricks, and tiles are used to build a series of good-looking cottages. Also, the representation of his ancient street still carries some formal criticality. And in his Wasan guest house project at China Academy of Art, this project, the spaces of traditional Chinese landscape gardens are abstracted into a recreational promenade, which wings its way up and down with the terrains and floors through the public spaces of the guest house. So although the traditional imperial roof is reserved, I think the joint forms of traditional brackets components are pushed to extremes. Numerous wood components are piled and repeated to form a kind of a dense texture and even deliver certain sense of a kind of a contemporary Baroque aesthetics. So in this work, landscape gardens becomes a source to build the cultural imaginations and the metaphorical forms. Similarly, the critics often mention these works of his together with the several other contemporary architectural practices of three other architects, namely Dong Yugan, Tou Ming, and Ge Ming, who also deals with the garden spaces a lot and regarded as four architects who teach as colleges while conducting garden space designs as the four contemporary garden masters. So more or less, the status of a man of letters or the traditional Chinese literati from the traditional Chinese culture, which is almost impossible in modern times, is reflected in both their design philosophy and their living conditions. They even have stirred up a kind of cultural movement to study conventional garden literature, making contemporary garden research thriving in China for a while. So Absorbed in a brick construction, Dong Yugan combines creatively the kind of brick buildings technology of something that reminds us of Louis Kahn or Carlos Capa with their the traditional Chinese garden spaces in a marvelous manner. So these are some other brick buildings he built up. However, his pursuit of the space monumentality in the Red Brick Gallery and some other projects seems a far cry from the aesthetic mood of landscape gardens. Rarely using traditional architectural forms or materials, Tong Ming, an architect from Shanghai, and Ge Ming, an architect based in Nanjing, they both employ spatial organization methods of landscape gardens into their works, such as a series of courtyards which enable concrete beams and columns, while walls and other modern buildings components could to be understood poetically as a kind of reflection of the traditional Chinese garden spaces. For example, Tong Ming pursued extreme spatial changes in limited spaces based on modern forms and materials in his Han Tianheng Museum, this one. And also, the Zhou Chunya studio, which is a studio for a famous contemporary Chinese artist, through his Ruyuan Garden, and this is another studio designed by Tong Ming for the artist Zhou Chunya. Another image of that. So in his Ruyuan Garden designed at Rugao, the architect Ge Ming presented a kind of evolution different from the series of courtyards, visual organization, and the rock work in traditional gardens in a contemporary design language. These are some other images of the same project. And also, beside in the Jixi Museum, architect from Beijing, Li Xingang, takes the winning roof skylines in the traditional Chinese buildings as an echo to the kind of surrounding natural landscape. So similar, I think it's quite similar to the way that I.M. Pei was dealing with his Suzhou museums, and also his hotel at the Hill of Fragrance in Beijing many years ago, who was termed as a kind of postmodern kind of approaches to deal with Chinese tradition. So similarly, method also appears at the Nantong University, the Fanzhen Museum gallery designed by Original Studio, where dark and light gray tones and the translucent curtain grills create conjointly a poetic image of a traditional Chinese ink and wash painting. Rooted in northern west China, architect Liu Kecheng blended the dignified and low ecology, low technology sustainability in the form of earth houses or the cave houses from the north part of China, the construction style of northern architecture into his works. For instance, using clay materials and cave-like construction from the Fuping Pottery Art Village Museum and artworks in the Shanxi provinces. In the meantime of the urban construction, also a new trend is emerging in China. Growing numbers of independent architects leave cities for villages to conduct the design and the construction of rural architecture and participate in the transformation of rural society. Because of the air pollutions and unsafe food and the traffic, all the problems in the big cities, more and more young architects are moving to the city and settle to the villages and settle down there. Architects' design gathered in cities until the recent decade. Due to the low economic and cultural level, villages are always beyond the vision of architects in their practices for many years. We don't have architects to design projects in the villages for many years. So over the past decade, the congestion and also industry pollution in Chinese cities have pushed architects to turn to the rural areas, while the kind of nostalgic dream continues. So where they can find a peaceful landscape there in the villages. For instance, the Earth Building on the Bridge Primary School, designed by Li Xiaodong, won the 2012 Aga Khan Award for Architecture, and the House for All Seasons, designed by Hong Kong-based architect Zhang Ling. This is the bridge school that is used as a bridge to connect the two parts from the river, but also could be used as a school if they close the flexible, adaptable kind of movable walls that you could divide it into bridge into several classrooms for the students. And also the Hong Kong architect, this is another project designed by the same architect Li Xiaodong. It's a library in the suburb of Beijing. And the Hong Kong-based architect Zhang Ling won the Ralph Erskine Architecture Award because of this house for 4 seasons. Like an artist, designers and social workers who arrive at village to participate in the rebuilding of rural communities. Some independent architects also choose to stay in the village to continue the construction work and even more move out of cities to become part of the rural community. So this is the interior of the House of 4 Seasons. These are some architects are working in the villages, Zhao Yang, Wang Hao, Huang Yingwu, Chen Haoru, and He Wei among them. A number of works that combine the professional training on the architects with the rural construction traditions, living customs, and also local materials and climates emerge, such as the Victory Street Community by Zhu Xiaofeng, the scenic architecture based in Shanghai. Zhu Xiaofeng also graduated from here, GSD. And Machabawa Visitor Center by Tsinghua University professor, Zhang Ke, a GSD graduate, and standard architecture. This is a Machabawa Visitor Center, and another visitor center in Tibet, Yushu, Janamani Tourist Service Center by Zhang Li, the Tsinghua University professor. His practice is called Team Minus, etc. So in addition, a new pattern that combines digital technology and culture critique has come up in Chinese architecture groups. They either borrow the parametric design method or brand new digital form from the West, or express the attitudes of critical transformation to the traditions, or generated the kind of possibility of a culture reinterpretation to China's low technology and hand-built traditions. For example, through dazzling visual effects of stainless steel and the bubble from that form that looks like coming from the outer space, MAD, Ma Yansong remodeled Beijing's traditional Hutong social structure criticality with kind of Hutong bubble project. And also in the Silk Wall and Lanxi Courtyard project, architect based in Shanghai, also Tongji professor Yuan Feng, uses the digital technology to translate the traditional materials and the intentions in traditional paintings, such as silk and sloping roof, hence enabling the parametric technology to be put into practice and strike roots in the kind of construction reality of China. So from village to cities, from culture architecture to residential architecture, after 2 decades of destructive construction, all the historic quarters are dismantled. China's contemporary architecture practice is expecting a kind of new tradition of architecture. It is a careful borrowing rather than a just literary, direct and shallow appreciation of the traditional building culture and space logic, and also a cultural renaissance after the baptism of the Western modern architecture rather than conservative, subjective construction, a coexistence of diversified and varied solutions rather than simple duplication to the mainstream experience. So sooner or later, the practice of these independent architects will generate similarly to acupuncture, a kind of acupuncture, because of the mass production of China still bear a lot of criticism because of no consideration, no deliberation. So, but the kind of acupuncture effect phenomena that the individual architects are building small buildings to generate a kind of dynamics to initiate evolution. So I would call this acupuncture effect through some individual cases, and hence push forward the kind of whole construction industry and even the whole public to have a critical and innovative recognition to the tradition and history in China in the future. Thank you very much. be questioned.
So I don't know if you want to, do you have an order or who wants to make a, I mean, what we try to do is short responses with some question or comment that we can continue elaborating, okay? Some doubts, comments? Chris, you know well this maybe you can...
So I have to start. I'm just gathering my thoughts. I mean, thanks for sharing this. Maybe I start with a question, and maybe I will then follow up with my interpretation of what you just presented. Of course, you've titled your presentation "A New Tradition," right? I mean, in a sense, it's somewhat paradoxical in terms of the two words, right? It's both new, but it's also old.
Yeah.
So if you could summarize, in a sense, what to you it's new and what versions of the old that are being kept, perhaps it will help me in my next response.
Okay, I think in the beginning of 20th century, in the generation of Liang Sichen, they started to come here to study. They studied in the UPenn that time, which is the Beaux-Arts. But when they go back, they trying to turn to the rediscovery of traditional Chinese architecture, but in a new era. I think I use the term that new tradition. It's not only looking back to the tradition and try to reinterpret and reproduce it, but building a new tradition which is a mixture of the influence from the architecture education they had here. Like most of the architects I presented here, they graduated from here, GSD or Columbia, Princeton, and Yale. But the problem is that right now they try to reflect the kind of a reality that when China was no longer sticking to its the older building technology like wood, because wood is not possible in China because of the fire code is very strictly prohibiting building with wood, and also bracket systems, which is the traditional Chinese language. So they were bringing a kind of language from modernism like Le Corbusier or Louis Kahn or Carlos Capa, whatever, to China, and to try to mix that with a little bit of a Chinese essence of what they learned from the things like gardens or the kind of painting or contemporary art to reflect a contemporary condition of China. That's why I always use Zhang Yimou as a case. The famous Chinese director, that he was always showing the images for traditional, the kind of imagination of a Chinese past. But instead, the younger generation like Jia Zhangke are reflecting more about the real social and cultural condition in China, which is not very known to the Western world, but it doesn't satisfy the Western eyes a lot. But this is the real condition in China. So I think in several decades or half century, when people are looking back to now, this will become a new tradition other than the tradition we had before. So that's why I use the term new tradition.
Right. Right, okay. I think if that's the case, then I think we need to make a clearer distinction between what do we mean by tradition, because I think in the examples you've shown, I think we could see that tradition can be both an image as well as a way of working, right? And if I have to choose two projects that you've shown and two architects that you've shown, then I would say Yuan Feng, in a sense, it would use a traditional image, but the process is not traditional. Right. Wang Shu would be the opposite. Wang Shu ends up with the architecture that has no traditional image, but in which its process and its method is incredibly traditional. Now, let me illuminate what I mean by that. I think Wang Shu's work to me is more interesting than this one, precisely because he uses, and I think this is also your thesis, that there's a certain retreat to interiority, to the countryside, to adaptive reuse. Because I think in traditional Chinese culture, I think the concept of yin and yang, a relational logic, right, is more important. That is to say that if I were to compare, let's say, a Palladian villa that sits and punctuates a landscape and in which it sits as an autonomous figure in an expanded field, So we can say that the relation between self and other is one that is confrontational and separate. Whereas let's say we were to take a Siheyuan, a traditional Chinese courtyard house that is composed of walls and pavilions, that relation between outside, inside, nature and architecture is not confrontational, it's relational. That is to say that the binary opposites, it's one that always tries to seek equilibrium between the two, harmony in a sense. So that's why I think if we were to take that as an approach, then I think the work of Wang Shu to me is incredibly interesting, because the way he uses material, to use brick, to use timber, he's not the first guy who has used it and not the last guy who will use it. But it's precisely that the way he used it to adapt to the existing context, existing building, existing site topography, and to the extent of the way in which craftsmen or builders are able to use it. So it is an architecture, it is incredibly imprecise and is able to adapt to this different condition. So although the image of his architecture at the end of the day to me doesn't look traditional at all, but the approach, the way of working to me resides precisely within this tradition of a relational logic, the finding equilibrium between two opposites. Whereas in this example, I think, for instance, using a parametric approach, each placement of the tile has to be incredibly precise. Any deviation would render the entire composition useless or pointless, right? Because of the gradient, it has to be so precise. So to me, this method of working is not very, in a sense, Chinese or traditional, although the image, the roof, the material is very traditional. So I think we need to make this separation between what we mean by traditional. Are we recreating an image of tradition, or are we working in a traditional way? And then when I mean traditional, it resides in, of course, the cultural history that is underpinned by Confucianism, Yin-Yang philosophy, and Taoism.
Do you want to respond?
The argument I want to make is that after the period of China Pavilion of Expo, which is the earlier way of simply borrowing an image. So now there are people from different perspectives and using different methods and technologies, trying to break away from that simple borrowing of an image and try to inject the different things into it. Even Wang Shu, I'm very close to him, that I wrote many reviews of his works, and he never showed you the earlier works of himself, because when he was reading all those books of Derrida and Foucault, and also he was learning from, I think, Peter Eisenman. He did some kind of deconstructionist architecture, but he never showed. So I think at that period, it's also, although he doesn't want to show it, but it's critical to his philosophy, development of thinking, because he tried to combine the new things as he's not on. He didn't study outside China. He didn't come here, Europe or United States to study. But generally deep inside, he know the philosophical kind of reflection of a tradition. That's what he learned from those books. Maybe there's a misreading of Derrida or misreading of the French philosophies, but Roland Barthes. But I think at least he tried to reinterpret or look at the tradition from different perspective. I think this is inherent in his own logic. That's why he's very unique. He's also very self confident about his own approach. This is very rare in Chinese architects, or even among the architects in the world, because he not often he doesn't look at the works of other. He doesn't read the architectural magazines. That's something crucial to his practice as well. So I think it's very unique. But of course, in China, people are always we can have everybody work or design like Wang Shu. So there are different approaches from trying to approach something from different angles or different approaches. That's what I want to show here. as a kind of a mosaic.
We have to go with shorter interventions.
Sorry. Sorry.
You can respond wherever you want. Eduardo,
Thank you, Xianin, for your interesting lecture, which shows a very rich and a very complex and also maybe sometimes paradoxical context and paradoxical panorama of Chinese architecture nowadays. But my impression, maybe I'm wrong, but my impression is that you have talked about exceptions maybe in this search, this attempt to create, to translate into contemporary language, old traditions, and the old understanding of Chinese architects. And so my question is that maybe the challenge is not how to find a new language, a new modern language, a new contemporary language. This is of course important, but not the only thing. And the challenge maybe has to do in the sense how to deal with the huge urbanization of China today.
Yeah.
So maybe the exploration should be not only in terms of style, in terms of buildings, but also in terms of types, how to deal with the complexity, with the necessity on the one hand of having so levels of density in cities, and how to create others way of understanding the problem of the city, and how to combine this a new understanding of the city with new types, architectural types based on the tradition. So I think this is the real, maybe the actual challenge for Chinese architecture, because all those buildings are very interesting, are amazing in some aspects, but maybe are just small examples in the huge panorama of China.
Yeah.
What do you think about?
I think because this is only one presentation with the topic of connection with tradition. So I selected a small group of works that will satisfy the kind of requirements by Iñaki. But of course, in the courses that I'm teaching here at GSD, there are 2 lectures every week. So I presented under different categories like urbanism. Of course, it's a very radical and contemporary issue pressing in all Chinese architectural practices. Guys like Qingyun Ma and the group influence from people like Rem Koolhaas and also MVRDV. The kind of diagram is also very present in Chinese architecture. So these are some other topics I covered in the lecture course as well. So from here, I'm dealing with the one aspect. I think it's like a slice of Chinese architecture from certain perspective. That's why you see here. Of course, there are beyond the mass production. This is one group of people.
But I think that a way to reframe the question of Eduardo is: do you think that this approach has an impact in the way the contemporary architecture is dealing with the megaplot or the CBD or all these other scales? I mean, there is a kind of link that you can establish or in the future?
In this sense, I think that the link may be the intermediate scales.
No.
Between buildings and the problem of the city. And maybe this problem of medium scales should be faced with a reflection on types one more time. Maybe, I don't know. So in this context, the reinterpretation of the traditional types of Chinese should be important. It is not about style, but it is not about cities, but it's something in between. So I think your lecture should be maybe more rich if you have presented this way of understanding the type, how to translate old types into contemporary types as a kind to reflect about the cities, about the future of urban planning and so on.
Yeah. Also, one thing to mention is that in China there's a very important. I'll use the term that the problem that most of the large-scale projects are in the hands of the state-owned, the large design institute. So those kind of independent architects here excluded from, when they're designing projects like CCTV. They either invite international architects or the big companies to do so. So all those independent and individual architects are excluded from this system. That's why here you see the kind of gap. That's why at the very beginning, and also in my earlier many writings, I mentioned the gap between the selected projects exhibited worldwide on the neat taste and the very nice articulation of architecture quality, and also the mass production, which you will see in any major cities, the large plazas and the major boulevards, urban design scale. You see the contrast and also tension in China these days, because the gap between the two groups of people, one the independent, good cutting edge architect, and also the large mass production of architecture. I use the term design, but also production, or it's a design industry, and that's the huge kind of gap between there.
It's very important.
My question is comes at it somewhat sideways.
Close to the microphone.
One of the places, obviously, where tradition and newness or change or intersect is in pedagogy or in education. And this, for the first year this year, I had a crash course during MArch II admissions, as Iñaki knows, in just looking through hundreds of portfolios. And it was actually quite fascinating to see and to get what was probably a somewhat inaccurate picture of exactly the way the education is playing out right now. So I'm just curious, one of the things that seemed to come forward in a lot of student work was a kind of tension between experimentation and a tremendous energy in experimentation, but then that seemed to be oftentimes placed into maybe a common software format or something like that. And so my question is, how are technological changes being taken up at the level of education? I mean, you mentioned parametrics in the level of the construction industry, but is that same dialogue being played out now at the level of education, or is it still the case that an architect or an architecture student will have to come here to acquire certain kinds of technical skills and then return?
I think there are also the pedagogical kind of method is also very divided among Tongji schools in architecture schools in China. There is also debate about where. What's the aim of training those students? One is that you want to encourage them to be very usable by the big design companies. Like as soon as they graduate, they could design proposals, projects like 100,000 square meters. Right. That's the situation that many students, as soon as they not like in Europe, that young architects, when they graduate, they start with a table design or furniture, and they're getting bigger and bigger. Chinese students, as soon as they're jumping into projects like 100 square meter at a sudden. So there's a bunch of educators believe that this is the aim of a student, because this is the need of the society. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there is a group of a good architect and educators are trying to encourage students to think differently and critically. So this group of students, most of them are coming to GSD and many other American universities. You can see that. So you see the reflection in their portfolio, the struggling between the kind of experimental aspect of architecture, but also the kind of a large scale manifestos of a Chinese ability of building things. So you still see the kind of gap there too. Mm-hmm. So you see some students are doing very good tiny experimental works, but at the same time there are kind of monsters also in their portfolio.
Mm-hmm. Can I add to this, because I mean this is something that implies all of us, because it's a global community, the education. I think that one of the frustrations I have with our admissions process, I have many, but one and the biggest probably is the lack of capacity of the architects that are instructors here to understand the different takes of different schools. And for example, very clearly, I think that we have lost some of the best Nanjing students. You're from Nanjing, by the way.
Yeah,
The Nanjing students, because in this school we have very few people that can understand the typological trend that if we were in Zurich, every instructor would have immediately identified these guys. And if there is not a kind of parametric, if there is not a kind of game of shifts, of movement inside, we tend to think that they are poor students. While, I mean, once you begin to understand the different cultures that you see in different schools and who are the protagonists of this discussion, which is not a battlefield, it's a discussion, an intellectual discussion, I think that changes completely the panorama, completely. So, and I think this is what is happening now. Some schools are having, I would say, a position that looks more to, I would say, some schools in Europe as a reference, but are identifying their own position. Others are mimicking literally other schools in the West Coast, you know, those that are more radical in formal terms. Others are trying to mimic this coast, like are more cultural and more sophisticated. And you can distinguish quite well the roots. I mean, all of us have a root in other schools, no? But you can identify very well this thing. And it's, I think it's fascinating in this moment. Panorama, a landscape, because all these ingredients are together, but we are unable to distinguish them.
I think because you know that the Chinese architectural education in the modern sense starts from the people who study abroad. So we have to. It seems not have to, but it happened that every school is connected with a kind of a tradition from the Western world. Like take the three major architecture schools in China, namely Tsinghua, Tongji, and the Southeast University in Nanjing. So I think Southeast University used ETH as their model. So they were fixed on a kind of a very minimalist, very rational layout of organization of structure, that kind of thing. And also Tsinghua is a university, it's an elite university of China. Not only architecture school, but the whole university was pushing the students to be the leaders in that respective disciplines. That's why it's their approaches are always different. And Tongji, of course, Tsinghua was associated with the UPenn because their founders are studied in at UPenn. And Tongji, and we said we have a connection because we are used to be a German university, so we had a connection with Bauhaus. But actually, the architecture school, the founding director of the architectural school of Tongji was a student of Gropius at GSD. So we have the connection with GSD here. So you see the major difference. The distinguish of the different mainstream lines of architectural schools in China these days. So I think it will continuously in the future also have some impact on the pedagogy ideas of architecture education and also practices in the future because of the connection with the Western world since the 20th century, the beginning of 20th century.
We have to open to the public, but Chris wanted to add something.
Yeah,
Can
quick question.
Short?
Yeah, short. I promise, very short. Zhang Ning, you said that architects that you have shown here, they are in a way outsiders to the process of urbanization in China in response to Eduardo's question. Now, as we see today, as China, or especially the state, is becoming more ambitious in exerting their cultural power elsewhere and also in China, do you think that architects that you've shown here will be co-opted by the state? And do they see them as emblematic figures that portrays a certain tradition of Chinese architecture?
I think I agree that you see the reception when before Wang Shu won Pritzker Prize, nobody knows him. Then when the news was released, the first thing I think the Minister of Construction will say, "Who is this guy?" Because they never heard about him before, or they never pay any attention to his works because it's out of mainstream kind of things. And also later, I think the value of this kind of architectural practice is, as I said, there's an acupuncture that is the joints and the critical point that you want them to be there. And after Wang Shu won Pritzker Prize, and there's there's some people that suggesting that Wang Shu should be the chief architect of Beijing, and he will design all the buildings along the Chang'an Boulevard. So I think that will be another disaster. The value of these kind of things is that they're there always as a measure of what we're doing right now. So it should, if everybody was doing a Wang Shu building and the whole city was built, Wang Shu designed the whole city, that would be also a disaster. So this is the kind of we are happy to see in certain kind of a sense that the juxtaposition of that kind of two things, and in a kind of a balance. Of course, there are discontent about this kind of situation, and they are excluded from the mainstream. But at the same time, it is critical that we have this strength as not just like a stingy kind of things.
Okay. So I'm sure that we have a lot of people that, yeah, Mark, let's begin.
Well, I want to thank you for an extraordinary talk and the range of projects and also your comments on the different practices and your ability to sort of group them. That was really amazing. And I also have to commend the panel because those were three really great questions that are hard to follow up on. I was most my own initial reaction was very much similar to Chris's about sort of understanding the role, the way that tradition is understood. It actually is kind of reminiscent to me of Japan in the 1950s, where there was a whole debate, a public debate among architects about the new traditions that needed to be created in the new modern society, a new democratic society. And Kenzo Tange was very much a public spokesman, but there were many, many people involved. It's interesting to me, and this is leading to a question, that although the architects in Japan had long enjoyed a kind of prominence that made them public intellectuals, in a way that I think is only your story about Wang Shu being unknown to the construction minister reveals that there's been a long period of anonymity among architects in big questions about the city. But in fact, much of the innovation, much of the enabling of the creation of a new tradition, which involved creating new construction methods and new ways of imagining space, much of that was enabled by the research and development capabilities of the Japanese construction firms, which were, in some sense, leading rather than following the initiative of architects. I'm wondering what role, sort of what kind of relationship you feel is taking place between architects and builders and researchers about construction to enable these kinds of new, amazing kinds of structures to be built?
You see a kind of a very dangerous break among architects and also the industry. So as I said, that I know that in Japan that architects are supervising the construction companies. They're responsible for making all the construction drawings and working out the details instead of architect itself. But of course, he's sitting on top of them. But in China, we don't see the consciousness yet in the design and builders that try to follow. Because so that's why all these independent architects they spend like at least 4 or 5 times of energy to talk with. They need to design everything. You cannot select the best, a nice handle, door handle from the catalog of a company. So you have to tell them, maybe you even need to design one. So because you don't have the industry that's supporting good design. So that's the reason. But now it's a start that furniture makers and also construction the builders are turning their eyes and ears to architects. So it's just a start. That's why I said that when Chinese architects are doing some projects in China, they're always doing, they spend much more energy than needed if they are going to do it here. So because of this, the industry is easier to, the construction quality is good, but there you need to spend way more energy to talk with the builders, and because you don't have the very mature system of industry supporting architects as well. So and at the same time, when foreign architects like Richard Meyer or Stern, they are going to China, when they are building things, because they face the same problem. They're doing very bad, I have to say. So because if they lose the support of the industry and they are facing the Chinese market, the construction qualities, they cannot handle. That's the big issue for them.
Yeah, big one.
Well, thank you for organizing this talk in Yaki's effort, and also thank you for, Li Xianing's teaching the host master to introducing the students. What's going on in China in architecture field. My question is, I think you use a very dangerous and provocative word, tradition, because, for Chinese culture, it has 3,000 years history, and which part of tradition we need to go back when we build a building, and we need to find affiliation with. I think that's one question. Probably it's going to be, it's challenging. That's one. And then two, I think among the architects that you've shown here, some of them are very, in their process, they're critical, they are very thoughtful in terms of material, in terms of, the process. But some of them, I have to say that there is the process of imitating form. Sometimes we can see that if there is a famous Western architect create a certain form, soon you'll find that form being, produced by some young architects. It doesn't matter trend inside China or trend, outside China. You can find that kind of imitation. So form is still, as a driver of production of architecture here. So my question is, how do you think that as architects in China, when there's so many contemporary challenges, the search for returning back to tradition should be, a component in their creativity process?
So I think to the first question, that the use of the term tradition, that there are two kinds of tradition I'm talking about. The one is the building and technology, the materials that like Wang Shu was using, and I see a new tradition. I use the new traditions, starting from the modern architectural education, and I think if you go to China decades ago, all the architectural schools are providing the same courses and same cases that you didn't distinguish them, and these days when you see the several generations that you feel the kind of thing that like Frank Lloyd Wright has many students and they all develop into their own career, that you see people like Yong Ho Zhang and the group of young architects who worked in his office before, and now they're starting their own career. You see the impact of the older generation. You see the continuity of among generations. That's a very good thing. You see Kenzo Tengi and Izuzaki, and below him and Toyo. So this is the kind of new tradition, also of education, and also build up through the decades. I think which is very critical. So you see that Zhao Yang was a graduate. He used to work for Zhang Ke, and then now he started his own career. And so still you see the trajectory and the impact of the older generation to the younger, and also. What's the second question again? Sorry, but imitation. I think it's very hard to say that which form is an imitation, because as architect, if you look at architectural images or magazines, you consciously or unconsciously you are imitating forms. Like Peter Eisenman was doing something very close to Frank Gehry, the kind of high rise. So I think the critical thing is not literally just simply say that this image is very close to that, and then that's a copy. By copying images is also so reinterpret is another way that by developing this thing into something else, you want to look at also the site-specific issues, like how to solve the problem on this specific site. Then even the image is a little borrowing, like a Chinese ink and wash painting. If you look at the, for centuries, they're almost the same. And Chinese calligraphy, they're almost the same. But you know that, but when he was dealing with a specific issue, then there was something different added into that. So it's very hard to distinguish, I have to confess. But at the same time, you want to distinguish carefully between the simply copy and the original copy.
My second question is less about imitation, but more about that in the process of creativity, that to what extent this huge burden of tradition from China needs to play a role in that process. Because I would say a lot of architects and including us, we always feel that burden of history and tradition. How are you going to interpret that in the process? I guess that's a huge question, but I'm just wondering your own thoughts.
I think, yes, there's huge burden. I think there's another case, which is Italy. I think if you look at the history of Italian architecture, it almost occupied half of the architectural history of the whole world. But look at the contemporary design, architecture design in Italy is pretty weak comparing with Spain, with Germany, with Switzerland. So the burden of history is quite obvious there, in China too. But the good thing is that, because there's a break, in generations, because it's a bad thing that we break with the tradition, but also if the young generation will, they're breaking away from the tradition. But at the same time, if they're conscious, they have the concept, they have the idea, capacity to look at the tradition, not as this, you are the God, I have to follow you, but something that I could use for my own sake. This is maybe a chance for Chinese architects. That's why you see that people are saying that Yonghou is the first modernist architect in China. I don't believe this so, but I don't believe so. But he's a critical figure because people believe through his career that we see a different path from the earlier generation, that we could do an alternative path in Chinese career.
We are having to close, but I cannot repress myself asking you a last question about extending this idea. I want to put on the table the new normal, because you talk about new tradition, and what we know is the president was complaining against the iconic turn in a kind of a very generic term, as it has come to us, but has been interpreted by many as a return to the most conservative and almost fastest architecture traditions, and instead of interpreting it as a kind of possibility of discussing the new trends, or how much these kind of positions can imply a revision of the, let's say, corporate iconic turn, and a revision of the old traditions that doesn't work anymore. So I think that just to put up a bit of pressure on you, I think that people like you that have a lot of responsibility in communicating architecture in China, you should take, let's put it in a question. Do you think that you should take responsibility and face this kind of challenge in ideological terms? And for example, the biennales are always generic, hundreds of stuff, but never, like I remember with Aldo Rossi, the Triennale of Milano, that he presented a trend and changed the whole panorama of the world. No? Do you think that there is this possibility? Do you think the new normal has something to do with this?
No, I think I have to confess that I don't know what the president means when he says new normal. But I understand that the application and the understanding of architects through that. In China, when the big boss is saying something that, for example, he was saying that we shouldn't build weird architecture. Behind that, it's I know the behind the screen story that. It starts with some buildings with Zaha. But I shouldn't say this because of Zaha. Then, that interpretation of the people under him is very different. A policy is there, so I think the government wants to talk about the new norm. It's the way that the governance is operated. But architects and planners, of course, will take that as their own job to reinterpret it or interpret the kind of new normal. I don't think new normal will be a very pressing issue for architects and planners, but maybe for planners because the policy, the shifting of policy, but architecture, I don't take new normal that seriously.
Okay, well, it's more than enough in terms of time, not in terms of content. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Xiaoning. Thank you, all of you. It has been a great conversation.